Welcome to the Old Man Sailing Book Club. Continuing Old Man Sailing. Some dreams take a lifetime. The Royal Norfolk and Suffolk Yacht Club is right next to the harbour mouth in Lowestoft. When the wind is in the east, the swell comes straight in from the North Sea. The first time I mentioned I was going there, I received a message from a Facebook friend. Lowestoft? Fished out of there back in the 70s, skippering a 50-foot longliner. Cod in the winter and spur dog in the summer, together with a bit of trawling. Bloody horrible entrance with a good ebb tide and a bit of slop. Tide runs hard across the entrance, trying to push you into the north wall. Then as soon as you get your nose into the harbour, it pushes your stern around, trying to get you to hit the south wall. They had a massive tragedy there back in the 1800s. A summer storm came out of nowhere and they lost many lives at the harbour entrance, with the sailing boats unable to make it into the harbour before being smashed against the north wall. The Nautical Almanac is a bit more circumspect. Wind over tide, especially on the ebb, can make the entrance lively. In the marina, it just means the coffee pot falls over and the onions roll off the chopping board. It made me want to go sailing. I spent a day pedalling around town on my folding bicycle, buying last-minute supplies, including a 15-kilo bag of charcoal for the little heater. Charcoal is not heavy, so a 15-kilo bag is a very large bag indeed. Only the bottom third of it would fit into the basket on the front of the bike. I held it in place with my chin. I was going to need charcoal. This was only March after all, and I was heading north. I pulled up the chart on the Navionics app and started working out where to go for my lockdown. All around the Orkneys and Shetlands were any number of deserted coves where a solo sailor might anchor to isolate himself. Some of them had quays and even water taps. I could skip from one to another as the weather dictated. Elwick Bay on Shapinsay, for instance, was protected from all directions except possibly the southwest in really severe winds, which of course are not unknown up there. Anyway, it was only a mile across the sound to the Bay of Carness, which opened in the other direction. This was going to be brilliant. I could spend months up there and never anchor in the same spot twice. That was when the BBC News carried a plea from the local authority for the Highlands, asking the owners of camper vans and second homes not to head for their wilderness to isolate themselves. The reasoning went like this. In normal times, we would welcome you. It's just that our hospitals are designed for our local population, and if you get sick up here, you could overwhelm us. They didn't need to add that the demographic for the owners of camper vans and second homes was very much the same as the high-risk group for the virus. They hadn't specifically mentioned boat owners or the Orkneys, but you didn't need much imagination to see their point of view. Besides, who needs to get into an argument? For a moment I entertained visions of being chased from one cove to the next by posses of villagers in kilts waving claymores. Even though it might have been fun to play hide-and-seek amongst the islands, in the end common sense reasserted itself. And with it came the most sensible idea of all. If I wanted to isolate myself, what better way to do it than by going to sea? The way I saw it, territorial waters extended for 12 miles. Once I was outside that, I would be in international waters and beyond the reach of the law enforcement agencies. Nobody would be able to arrest me or tell me to go home or lock down or make me wear a mask or impose any of the other annoyances which the rest of the country was going to have to put up with. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to get out into the Atlantic. I was at home in the Atlantic. I had sailed it back in 1988, finally realizing my dream of competing in the single-handed transatlantic race. And of course, the obvious qualifying race for that was the Azores and back. I did that twice. The Atlantic would be ideal. I could slip out there and nobody would find me. I had made the passage to Falmouth so many times that I could tick off the headlands as if I was walking down my local high street. Instead of Boots and Costa and Sainsbury's, it was North Foreland, Dungeness, St. Catherine's, Portland Bill, Start Point. However, the one thing I had never considered was that there are no international waters in the Dover Strait. There just isn't enough room. Dover to Calais is 22 miles. Everyone knows that. Presumably, the French claim 11 miles on their side, where they would arrest me, and the 11 miles on the English side were patrolled most energetically by the border force. I could see my grand voyage ending ignominiously with a tow into Dover's Granville dock, there to serve out my lockdown like a prisoner. So, I would have to go north after all, up to the Orkneys and the Shetlands, only I wouldn't stop there. Instead, I would sail around the Muckle Flugger, the most northerly point in the British Isles, and turn left, and from there down the Atlantic to the Azores. I wouldn't just be 12 miles offshore, I would be hundreds of miles offshore. There was indeed only one problem. This was mid-March, and as the pilot book for the Shetlands pointed out, prudent cruising should perhaps be limited to the months from May to September. Never mind, I could wait, and I knew the perfect place, the east coast equivalent of Elwick Bay, the Walton backwaters. You will remember, this is where it all began. It was in Walton that my parents took me and my sisters sailing in the 14-foot Wilkie, 7,000 acres of creeks and saltings, a nature reserve where you could anchor and see nobody for weeks at a time. I have in the past anchored there for weeks at a time and counted 15 seals on the surface all at once, most of them ignoring me, but one or two staring with mild curiosity. They always seem to look like Labrador puppies with just their heads out of the water. Then there are the geese, hundreds and hundreds of Brent geese flying in formation across the enormous East Anglian sky, or picking their way delicately across the mudflats and honking, always honking. At high tide, you can see all the way across to Felixstowe Docks or the Naze Tower to the southeast. But when the tide goes out, leaving the mud sucking and popping and the saltings rise up to block out the rest of the world, then there is a solitude so complete that I doubt there could be any better place in the world to be isolated. No wonder the smugglers used to like it so much. When I spent my first summer there, I thought I was going to be completely isolated. As far as I could see from the chart, the only place to land would be Kirby Quay. That was a mile away, probably twice that by the time the channel had meandered between the saltings and the mudbanks. I would have to be quick, too. It was only accessible at high tide. I allowed myself a 3-hour window and dressed up in full wet-weather gear, with all the gash and the empty water cans and Google Maps on my phone to stop me following the wrong branch of the creek. I set off as if for any other expedition into the unknown. For some reason, the outboard motor refused to start. Odd that. Now that it had a new fuel tap, it had been very reliable. Maybe all it needed was a moment to cool down. 2 strokes of funny like that. I started rowing. An hour later, after several stops for hopeful pulls at the starting cord, during which I drifted backwards into the mud, a seal appeared and floated with just his head out of the water to see what I was doing. Actually, what I was doing was checking Google Maps and realizing that after an hour of hard rowing, I was still only halfway to the quay, which meant that by the time I got there, walked up to the village and back carrying 30 kilos of water and with the shopping on my back, the tide would be falling fast. What if I ran aground on a falling tide, marooned for 8 hours in a dinghy surrounded by thigh-deep mud? Some things just don't seem sensible. I admitted defeat and turned around. Of course, this meant rowing against the tide. I remember thinking that I was earning my lunch and calculated how long it had been since breakfast, and come to that, how long since I drank half a litre of vitamin and mineral supplement and a big mug of coffee, and how it is that one of life's more undignified manoeuvres is having a pee when you are in a tiny inflatable dinghy and trussed up in chest-high waterproof salopettes. Casting about for a solution, I spied a jetty. Well, a haphazard collection of old timbers sticking out of the mud with a few rotting planks on top. It would have to do. Somewhat gingerly, I stepped ashore and walked up the staging to what passed for solid ground. I know all about this place. It is a privately owned bird sanctuary, no landing allowed. Tamsin and I visited in 1995 and interviewed the owner when we were writing about our adventures for the Daily Telegraph. Indeed, this might very well have been the spot where Blue the dog disgraced himself by catching a goose. The goose accepted it as one of life's little upsets. Blue was completely nonplussed. The place did not seem to have changed much. It was just as desolate as I remembered. In fact, having dealt with the urgent matter at hand, I took out my phone and recorded a quick 360 for Instagram. As you can see, I told the phone, absolutely nobody about. Totally desolate. That was when I noticed I wasn't alone. An equally old man with a white beard and a woolly hat had appeared, apparently out of nowhere. He carried 2 plastic bags and regarded me silently. I think I should be congratulated on finding something to say. This was it. "Oh, hello. I've just stopped for a pee. I hope you don't mind." I'm afraid I can't remember what he said in reply. Would you? But he did ask me if that was my boat anchored further down the creek. "You can't anchor there," he said. "That's an oyster bed." Really? I didn't know about that. There's nothing in the book about it. "There's a sign," he said. I peered. A sign? I didn't see a sign. Where is it? "It blew away." Ah. It turned out there hadn't been an oyster bed there for 30 years. Never mind. I found a spot which would have been beyond it anyway. Also, I found a much better way of getting ashore. Hidden between Honeypot Island and Skipper's Island was a tiny channel which led to another rickety landing stage occasionally maintained by the locals, who owned a handful of moorings there. Sometimes I thought about helping with the maintenance, since the second step from the top was loose and would float off during high spring tides. Fortunately, it was so old and waterlogged it would sink straight to the bottom, and I could retrieve it at low tide and put it back, ready for the next time. Once up the steps and onto the staging at the top, I could unfold my bicycle and push it across the path of wooden planks to the sea wall. The bicycle would need manhandling up the wall, where I could push it along the path for 1/4 of a mile to an old barn and the beginning of a farm track. This led between the sugar beet fields for 1.5 miles to the farm itself. There the track turned into a concrete roadway. This was the cue to change boots for shoes and get on the bike to pedal the 1/2 mile to the main road. I say main road, but the B1034 is hardly that, although it does, after another mile, lead to Kirby Le Soken, 2 pubs, 2 churches, 1 shop. I didn't go ashore very much, but the farmer would let me use his water tap when I needed it. Besides, I was supposed to be isolating. In those early days of the virus, nobody knew much about it. I certainly didn't want to catch it in the post office stores and then get sick 2 weeks later hundreds of miles from land. It could have been worse. I could be stuck at home, advised to shield like the other old people. Here I was shielding much more effectively. In fact, I was more isolated possibly than anyone else in the country. If I looked through the binoculars, I could identify a barn about a mile away, but the nearest person had to be further than that. Even the wildlife warden and the seal watching boats didn't come by anymore. And of course, the seals kept their distance as usual. Chapter 2. The radio news was full of advice on how to survive lockdown. Everybody was cooking. The shops were out of flour. The family WhatsApp group showed photographs of the Friday night "Come Dine With Me," with everyone in fancy dress. I was getting the boat ready for what would be the longest voyage I had ever undertaken. Even the transatlantic race had been 32 days and about 2,900 miles. This promised to be much further. When I tried to work it out, I could not be entirely sure how much further, since I hadn't worked out exactly where I was going. The Azores would be the turning point. But was I just going to sail in sight of them, or go round the whole archipelago? There are 9 islands, and they cover an area of 800 square miles. If the panic was over by the 3rd week in August, I could revert to Plan A and meet the family at the Airbnb we had booked in Porto. In that case, I had hoped to visit as many of the islands as I could, particularly the ones I had never seen before. Also, I just had to go to Horta again to update Samsara's painting on the harbour wall. Horta is home to the Café Sport, the most famous sailors' watering hole in the world, and it is bad luck to call it Horta and not to paint your boat's name on the harbour wall. But the radio news was saying the whole world was locking down, and this could last for months. The islands would be closed, just like Curacao. I would have to stay at sea. Should I go round the Canaries as well, or Madeira, or just sail around going nowhere but killing time? When Donald Crowhurst tried doing that in the first single-handed round-the-world race, he went mad and jumped off the back of the boat, clutching his chronometer and thinking he was God. That was because he set out in a boat which was hopelessly unprepared. There was little doubt that he didn't want to go. In fact, he was terrified, but by then he had got himself in too deep. He had backers and sponsors. He had crowds waiting for him on the front at Teignmouth, TV cameras. He was an official entry in a race being sponsored by a national newspaper. People were counting on him. I hadn't even told my blog what I was doing. As far as my 86 followers were concerned, I was going up to Scotland to hide out in a little cove somewhere and read books. When I had set off into the Atlantic before, the preparations had taken 2 years, including the working up trip with the Azores and back race. I bought new sails, upgraded the rigging, installed a long-range radio so that I could send back dispatches to the Evening Standard. I carried all the safety equipment required by the rules, all of it inspected and verified by a team of scrutineers from the Royal Western. This time I was just setting off on a whim, almost as if this was a hop around the coast. But what else was there to do? Even if there had been time for a whole lot of boatyard work, there was nobody to do it. All the riggers and shipwrights had been sent home. I would have to do what I could myself. I had the best part of a month. That would have to be enough. The first and most obvious job was to check the rig, something that should be done every year. This involved going up the mast, which has never been my favourite pastime. I decided it had to be the first item on the list, the eat that frog philosophy. If you have to do something unpleasant, like eating a frog, it is best to get it done and out of the way. My reservations about mast climbing came not only from the perfectly natural fear of heights, but also because of what happened with my old boat, Largo, back in the 1980s. Largo was another rival 32, an old design even then, and she had the same short, stumpy mast. Given what follows, I have since developed a great affection for boats with short, stumpy masts. For some reason, I decided I had to climb Largo's mast, and it had to be done that very day. A Tuesday afternoon, as I remember, on a mooring in the middle of Poole Harbour. I was a reporter for the Daily Mail in those days, and we still worked a 4-day week, one of the delightful Spanish practices left over from the pre-Murdoch days. Anyway, it meant that every 3 weeks we enjoyed a 5-day weekend from Thursday evening through to Wednesday morning. This particular Tuesday was at the end of one of those. I had devised my own system for climbing the mast. It involved a 4-part tackle and simply miles and miles of rope. I had this theory that you could never have too much rope on a boat, and this was brilliant. I hoisted the top end of the tackle up the mast, attached myself to the bottom, and went soaring aloft like Icarus. And you remember what happened to Icarus. If you look at a block and tackle for a 10mm rope, you will find it is quite large. I just measured the tackle for Samsara's mainsheet, and it is all of 250mm from top to bottom, and that is without measuring the bowline where the line is tied off to the becket of the lower block. This was not something that seemed to be particularly important at the time, at least not until I reached the top. That was when I realized I wasn't quite high enough. All I needed was a couple more inches. And if I were to give one more pull, and indeed, with one more pull, whatever had been stopping me gave up the struggle, and I was at the top, screwdriver between my teeth, without a care in the world, apart from the little matter of how far I had to fall if something went wrong. Then came the time to go back down again. This was when I realized what it was that had been stopping me on the way up. It was the knot holding the tackle together, which had popped through the strands of rope, and was now jammed tight against them, stopping the whole thing from releasing. Of course, if I could just climb up a little higher, like a monkey perhaps, I could take my weight off the tackle and then with a third hand extricate the knot. It was at this point that I understood the wisdom of the old adage, "Only a fool goes on deck without a knife." But if I had taken a knife with me, what would I have done? Cut the rope? What would have happened then? I didn't like to think. For a while I stayed at the top of the mast, reviewing my options. I could not climb down. I was held securely in one of those cleverly designed bosun's chairs which fitted like a snug pair of underpants. In the old days, bosuns sat on a plank to go up the mast. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to slip off a plank. Presumably, this was why they invented the new version. Another thing, I could not untie the knot while the tension remained on it. Cutting the rope was out of the question. We'd been there. What I could do was stay at the top of the mast until I was missed at work on Wednesday, but how long would it take for the news desk to realize that I was not, after all, at home in Chiswick, but some 40 feet up in the air in Dorset? These days, I never go up the mast without my mobile phone, although it has occurred to me that I might prefer to stay up there rather than think about how to explain to HM Coast Guard why it is that I need rescuing. I'm not sure how long I spent up there debating all this, but it may not have been as long as it seems with hindsight. All the same, it was quite long enough for me to be disturbed by the familiar put-put putt of one of the two-stroke outboard motors we all used in those days. Sure enough, down below was a man in his dinghy setting off for the shore. "I say," I said, not wanting to over-dramatize the situation with "help" or anything as un-British as that. The man looked up. That is to say, he took notice. He looked to see where the hail had come from. He did not look up. "Over here," I called, which was no help at all. Then, "Up here." And finally, since at this rate it would never occur to him that he was being addressed by somebody at the top of the mast, "I'm stuck at the top of my mast, and I wonder if you could help me." He looked, and I could see him debating whether to help or to escape while he could. But help he did. He tied his dinghy to one of Largo's stanchions, climbed aboard, and eased me gently down to the deck. After I had extricated myself from the tangle of the chair and miles of rope, I turned to shake his hand and thank him and perhaps invite him for a cup of tea, which seemed to be the least I could do. But no, he was back in his dinghy and yanking furiously at the starter cord, evidently wanting to get away from this madman as quickly as he could. I have never used a tackle to climb a mast since. Instead, I have a pair of climbing devices called ascenders, which you clamp onto a rope and can be pushed up it, but will not slide down it. You attach one to a pair of rope stirrups around your feet, and the other to the boatswain's chair. Push with your feet, slide the chair up the rope, sit on the chair, and slide up the one attached to the stirrups. It works brilliantly. But you do need two of them. The one for the chair was still attached to it, but do you think I could find the stirrups and, more importantly, the ascender attached to those? I don't know what it is with boats, but they all seem to have a secret compartment where stuff goes to hide. There was also a very expensive snatch block in there, and had been for years. I thought it would come out when I bought another, but no, apparently because the replacement was only second-hand and dirt cheap. Anyway, the second ascender had gone to join it. I did try an alternative method using the descender as an ascender, but I suspect you can guess how well that worked. So the result was that I never did climb the mast before setting off. The reasoning went like this. If I find something wrong, what am I going to do about it? All the riggers have been locked down. On the other hand, if the mast stayed up, then I had nothing to worry about. If it didn't, then I would start worrying when that happened. If I was going to worry about everything, I would never go anywhere. This has been Old Man Sailing. Some Dreams Take a Lifetime, by John Passmore, and read by the author. We shall return to this book in 9 weeks' time. Meanwhile, if you'd like to find out what happens next, you can buy it on Amazon, in Kindle or paperback editions, and it's also on Audible, read by Charles Robert Fox. Until next week, goodbye.